January 12, 2008, 7:42 a.m., Marquette, Michigan. Lake effect snow drifts past kitchen glass while Mark Pierce times 20 minutes on a Stain timer and watches his 19-year-old son, Logan, vanish into the white behind their garage. That timer dings. The yard is empty. No footprints return. No phone, no sound, only wind. What happened to Logan Pierce between the door and the trees? 8 years later, a small detail in a neighbor's yard will pull the case open like a hidden hinge. Until then, the town breathes shallow, and the snow learns how to keep secrets. Something under ordinary wood doesn't belong. The morning looks harmless, and that is its first lie. The wind schemes the roofline, skates along the frozen eaves, carries the clean metallic smell of lake ice. Logan prefers the cold because it sharpens the edges of thought. He pulls on a threadbare hoodie, ignores Dana's half-pleading, "Run the loop, not the shoreline," and grins as if rules are for other seasons. Mark sets the timer on the counter because routine is the one thing a parent can control. 20 minutes out. 20 minutes back. He sips coffee and counts the seconds by the quiet clicks of cooling baseboard heat. When the timer rings, he opens the door expecting a red knit beanie and that mock salute. He steps into the yard. The old fence leans right where it always leans, the gate half swollen, the neighboring porch dark. Footprints lead away in a crisp line. The next gust smears them into a soft, meaningless field. Mark calls once, twice, into the stand of black spruce. Only the sound of a distant plow answers. He tells himself to choose calm, to walk the loop, to meet his son grinning at the corner with a joke ready. He tells himself to choose calm and fails. By noon, calm has a siren. Volunteers bring flags and radios, the sheriff's truck idles at the curb, and someone drops off a box of thermal packs no one remembers asking for. The official narrative arrives in neat sentences. People slip. Lake ice can break. A 19-year-old could decide to leave. Morales won't join the case for years. Today it belongs to a team that knows the forms, knows the statistics, knows that time kills options. Mark and Dana stand inside their doorway and memorize the last thing they said to their son. "Don't keep replaying it," a deputy advises, gently. They already are. Across the street, Walter Briggs clears his steps with slow, careful strokes, the kind you use when there is more on your mind than ice. He nods when neighbors nod. He lifts a hand when Mark's eyes catch his, then goes back to the shovel and the neat rectangles of clean concrete. He used to sell cabinets before the recession. He can make joints meet without daylight. He can make a surface look like it grew that way. For now he measures the yard with his eyes, drifts toward the back fence, and disappears out of sight. Night comes fast that far north in January. Searchers trade out at the staging table. Dana folds and refolds a rectangle of foil blanket until it offers the lie of usefulness. She rereads the text string that stopped 3 days ago, then checks voicemail, then checks the porch for a shadow that won't be there. Mark walks the loop with a borrowed headlamp and a whistle that never leaves his lips. Back home he tapes a county map to the dining wall and marks radius after radius until the house looks like an archery target. He keeps the timer near the sink as if the bell can call a boy back. Days fold into weeks. The lake remains a flat sermon of gray. A rumor says a college teammate saw Logan hitching west on US 41. Another says he was at a gas station outside Eichpeming buying energy drinks and asking directions. Cameras show nothing that holds up. The case file thickens but does not deepen. Dana starts stacking each article into a metal box, labeling the lid in neat block letters, Logan. She tells herself this is not a coffin for paper. She tells herself organization is a form of prayer. Walter builds a dog enclosure out back. The town loves a project. Something to talk about that isn't the absence at the Pierce house, so it passes in conversation that he's thinking of adopting a shepherd, that he misses noise in the evenings, that busy hands keep ghosts in their rooms. He sets posts in the frozen soil and braces them with true cuts. No one asks why a man who has no dog needs a gate that locks from the outside. No one is looking for doors. They are looking for a boy. On the 7th Friday after Logan disappeared, the wind shifts. It brings the sound of a snowblower that isn't there. Mark hears it and writes it down anyway. On the map he draws a circle and a question mark and the exact time. He begins to keep a log: wind direction, plow routes, trash days, the single floodlight that comes on behind Walter's garage at 2:11 a.m., then again at 2:23, then not again for 2 months. This is how a parent lives after the world tips, by measuring what most people let pass. 8 winters in Marquette blur like breath on glass. Mark and Dana stay in the same house because leaving would be another kind of vanishing. The box labeled Logan grows heavier, its corners silvered with tape, its weight not linear but exponential. The backyard fence finally gives up and tilts until Walter, polite and quiet, offers to fix it with his tools. He drops in 2 new bolts near the old hinge and says not to worry about the bill. Mark thanks him, and later, alone, he stares at those bolts for a long time without knowing why. Sometimes an answer waits inside a habit. Sometimes it lives under something nobody would ever think to lift. On a February afternoon 8 years after the timer dinged, Mark bends at the waist to return a forgotten coat and hears a dog bark at a square of wood that isn't quite flush. He doesn't know it yet, but a hinge is about to speak. Listen to how the yard holds its breath. Detective Ana Morales didn't inherit the case so much as the case found her. In January 2016, she drove north out of Green Bay in a county cruiser that smelled of old coffee and road salt, crossing the ice-hazed bridge into Marquette with 1 file on the passenger seat and a promise she hadn't yet decided to keep. By protocol, she should have let sleeping paper sleep. By instinct, she opened the box labeled Logan at the Pierce kitchen table while the furnace clicked, while Mark stared at a map he'd already memorized, and while Dana steadied the room with a plate of cookies no one touched. A good cold case has silence you can measure. This one hummed. She started where people stop looking. She walked the 20-minute route at 7:42 a.m., the time stamped in Mark's log, then again at 7:42 p.m. with a headlamp and a cheap wind meter that squealed when a northern gust hit. She traced the plow schedules, dug up utility service orders, and asked Public Works why a streetlight behind the Pierce fence had been listed intermittent for 4 months in 2008, then quietly replaced. She pulled 911 audio from a blizzard night 2 streets over. Nothing useful, a slip and fall, a generator complaint, then listened again for anything human in the background. Habits hide in background. The first oddity wasn't a footprint or a fiber. It was a receipt. A hardware store in Negaunee paid in cash on February 8, 2008, for 2 galvanized carriage bolts, 8 inches each, and a package of exterior screws. The clerk wrote, "Customer requested longer shank." The address in the system matched Walter Briggs. Morales didn't write, "Gotcha," in the margin. She wrote why. She sat in her cruiser and read the note again, then drove to Briggs's place and stood in the yard pretending to admire the line of spruce while snow feathered her hair and the back of her neck burned with the feeling of being watched. Walter's window curtain moved, then stilled. He opened the door with a fixed half-smile and the slow cadence of a man who hated questions because they walked around at night and knocked on his bedroom wall. He offered coffee. Morales declined and asked about the fence he'd repaired for the Pierces that spring. He told her the posts were bad and the gate had sagged. He said a storm will teach you what your house is made of. She asked whether he kept dogs. He said he was thinking about it, work kept him busy, he hadn't decided. His eyes tracked left when he lied. She could have written him up just for that, eyes left on lies, right on memory, but she kept the note to herself and asked to see the yard. He hesitated half a beat too long, found a coat, and walked her out back like a man showing off a deck he'd built with his bare hands. The dog enclosure was well made. Too well made. The hinge plates were newer than the rest, edges crisp under a dusting of powder. On one lower slat, a smear of sealant had run and been wiped almost clean and then sanded so fine it looked like grain. Morales knelt and tapped the frame with her knuckle. Solid. She tugged the bottom board gently and felt give that shouldn't be there. She let go, stood, and praised the workmanship as if the compliment cost her nothing. In her head she sketched the rectangle, measured by boot, pictured a handle tucked under a false lip. She didn't pry. Not yet. Back at the Pierce house, she laid out what she could prove and what she only suspected. Most people think in bold strokes, she said, laying the hardware receipt beside Mark's circles on the map. A case like this lives in the thin lines. If you want to walk this with me, keep your notes close and your attention closer. We will recheck everything you were told was checked. It wasn't a sales pitch, it was a pact. Mark nodded. Dana, who had learned to conserve words the way you conserve heat, slid a box across the table. Inside were 3 things Morales hadn't asked for: Logan's favorite route scribbled on a torn envelope, a photo of the fence on the day Walter fixed it, Dana takes pictures when she can't breathe, and a scrap of red hoodie fabric from the laundry basket that never got washed. Morales visited the hardware store on her way out of town and asked to see security footage from 8 years earlier. The clerk laughed until he realized she meant it. There was no video, only a ledger with pinched handwriting and a habit of drawing stars next to cash transactions. 2 stars sat beside Walter's name. "Why the stars?" she asked. "Because the machine jammed, and I had to write it twice," the clerk said. "Small things leave echoes." She drove back under a gray noon and parked 3 houses down from Briggs, far enough to be just another resident eating an apple in a car. At 2:11 a.m., Mark's notes had said, a floodlight behind the garage flicked on. She didn't want a warrant for a light. She wanted a pattern that fit multiple locks. 3 days later, she stood on the public side of Walter's back fence and heard a dog bark when there was no dog, a deep, muffled sound like a voice behind a door. It could have been a TV. It could have been the wind under the sill. She wrote the time, stepped back onto the sidewalk, and dialed the number Dana had given her for anything, anytime. "Look out your back window," Morales said when Dana answered, whispering. "Tell me if a light comes on when a car passes the corner." Dana put down the phone. A long breath. "It just did," she said. "Twice." Some houses speak in code. This one was spelling something in Morse with a motion sensor and a habit. Morales closed the call and stayed in her car until night soaked the alley and every porch light in the block blinked out one by one. She waited for Walter to move, and he did, exactly when the wind picked up and the town turned its head. He carried a roll of plastic, a battery lantern, and something heavy that thudded once against wood and then vanished from sound. She wrote the time. She didn't follow him into the dark. She already knew where he was going. The question was how to open what he had closed without breaking the one thing a case like this can't afford to break: the moment when truth realizes it's been cornered. The next afternoon, Morales knocked on Walter's door with thanks for fixing the Pierce's fence and a request to see the joinery. He smiled at the flattery, then faltered at the threshold. Something moved behind him, a soft shuffle that could have been a draft and could have been a life. She didn't look past him. She looked at him, and the mask he wore to meet the world slid a fraction to the side. What kind of man builds a door and forgets to hide the handle? The forecast called it a clipper, fast and mean, the kind of February snow that arrives with a grin and leaves dents behind. By late afternoon, the sidewalks in Marquette were ribbed with fresh drifts, and Walter Briggs's backyard was a white stage lit by a single motion light that flicked on and off as the wind pushed at the sensor. Mark Pierce crossed the street with a coat folded over his arm. Walter had left it on a dining chair the night he came over to say the fence would be easy to fix. Dana watched from the window with the phone in her hand and Detective Ana Morales on speed dial, because Faith needed teeth now. The coat was an excuse. The real errand was the itch Mark couldn't scratch since he'd seen those 2 new bolts glinting in daylight. He knocked twice, listened, and heard only the hush of a television left low somewhere deep in the house. He knocked again and called Walter's name. No steps came to the door. A hard bark ripped the backyard quiet. Not the thin yap of a small dog, but the deep-chested warning of a large shepherd that believed the night was a job. Mark froze, listened for a leash jangle or a command, heard neither, and walked the side path toward the fence. The motion light sprang bright. Wind carved the snow's edge into a lip, and beyond it the new kennel threw a neat rectangle of shadow on the ground. The shepherd paced inside, chain taut to an anchor loop, and thrust its nose toward the floorboards, then shot a glare at Mark as if to say, "Look where I'm looking." "Easy, buddy," he said, keeping his voice level the way his father had taught him with nervous horses. The dog quieted but didn't back off. It stared at the same square of wood again and whined, nails clicking a Morse code none of this neighborhood had ever learned to hear. Markraut. The floor was smoother than the rest, sanded fine enough to pass a hand across without snag. He brushed away a thin drift at the edges and found what he had come to admit he wanted to find and feared to find: A metal lip recessed into the grain, a smudge where a padlock had sat, a line that said this wasn't a floor so much as a permission waiting to be asked. From the kitchen window, Dana breathed into the phone and said, "He's in the yard," and Morales told her, "Say nothing to anyone else. If Walter returns, stall him at the door. I'm 2 minutes out." The dog's ears snapped toward the alley, then back to the floor, as if guarding something that shouldn't require a guard. Mark eased the coat onto the fence post and looked for cameras, for the little gloss of a lens in the eaves, saw none, felt watched anyway. He slid a hand beneath the board and felt a hinge press against his knuckles like a heartbeat through wood. Walter's voice came from behind him, close and flat. "You're on my property." Mark stood slowly and showed empty palms. "You left your coat," he said, gesturing toward the fence. "Thought you might need it. Leave it by the door next time." Walter's eyes went past Mark to the shepherd, then dropped like a blade to the seam in the floor. He adjusted his scarf and put his hands in his pockets in a way that made a line run up Mark's spine. The motion light ticked off. The yard leaned toward dark. Somewhere a plow scraped, iron on ice. "You building something under there?" Mark asked. He kept his tone casual and failed, because his voice knew the stakes. "Looks like an access panel." "Storm shelter," Walter said. "Old property has old bones." He took a step, and the shepherd rumbled a warning, not at Mark, but at the floor itself. "Hush!" Walter snapped at the dog, and there was something in the command that belonged in a place with no windows. The gate latch clinked and Morales stepped in with a nod as if she lived here, badge clipped to her belt, stance loose and ready. She introduced herself like she hadn't already walked this rectangle a dozen times in her head. "Quick welfare check," she told Walter, easy as weather. "We've had calls about a generator noise after curfew and a light that won't quit." "No generator," Walter said. "And motion lights do what motion lights do." "Then you won't mind if we confirm." Morales turned to Mark without taking her eyes off Walter. "You good?" Mark nodded, and the shepherd seemed to nod too, drawing in one deep breath as if steadying for a command it had waited weeks to obey. Morales crouched where Mark had crouched. She ran a fingertip along the seam and glanced at the recessed lip, assessing leverage angles the way a carpenter reads grain. "You build this?" she asked, conversational. "I fix things," Walter said. "The world needs fixing." Dana's porch light came on across the street like a lighthouse trying to remember how to save ships. 2 more silhouettes appeared at the front walk, uniforms, steady and wide, one carrying a small thermal camera that turned darkness into temperature. The thermal showed a block of warm where the floor should have been cold. Morales didn't smile. She just breathed once, centered herself, and moved the latch. It wasn't locked. That was its own kind of message. "Don't," Walter said, too fast, then slower. "You need a warrant." "We have exigent circumstances," Morales replied, pointing with her chin at the thermal's blooming rectangle, at the ice halo around the kennel where heat had snuck up and failed to escape. "If someone's down there and in distress, we go." Walter's face did a small thing then, something that looked like grief trying on anger and finding it fit. He took a single step forward. The shepherd lunged at the floor again and barked sharp, not at the people, at the secret. The second officer reached for the leash clip to pull the dog aside. Mark put one hand on the edge of the panel, the other on the cold lip of the handle, and looked at Morales for the word that would change the past 8 years. She gave a tight nod. They lifted together. Warm air rose with a sound like a house exhaling. Then, from below, came the metallic rattle of a ladder rung being touched by someone who knew the pattern by heart. Someone was already on the way up. The ladder rang once, then again, metal on metal, a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind. Morales lifted her palm. Hold, and the yard learned how to be quiet. Mark could hear his own pulse in his ears, huge and wrong. The panel breathed warm air onto winter, a faint smell of canned soup and old paper rising up from the dark. A hand appeared first, pale under grime, then a forearm with a rope of strength that comes from work done in a small room. The man who surfaced blinked at the motion light like it was noon after a cave. Hair to the shoulders, a red stubble gone to auburn beard, eyes the same unfamiliar blue Mark had memorized a decade ago in photographs. He held nothing but the edge of the hatch, and for a second Mark's brain offered the impossible and then refused it. Logan Pierce looked around at strangers and settled on Walter like a compass finding north. "Back inside," Walter said, low and nearly tender, the voice of a man who'd taught someone how to breathe while counting to 4. "No," Morales answered him, not looking away from the man at the hatch. "Sir, I'm Detective Morales with the county. Keep both hands where I can see them and come up slow. You're safe." The man's gaze tracked to her badge, then to the other officers, then to Mark, who had said nothing because any word now might break the one thing he could still be. The man frowned, as if the faces didn't match the rules he'd been given. "There's shelling," he said, voice hoarse. "He told me not to surface under lights." "There's no shelling," Morales said, voice level. "You're in Marquette, Michigan. It's February. That's wind on aluminum and a plow 2 blocks over. Come up, please." He climbed fully out, bare forearms despite the cold, a thermal shirt with the cuffs turned ragged, work pants scuffed at the knees. He was older than the last time Mark saw him and somehow exactly the same. Dana stood at the fence with one hand to her mouth and the phone forgotten. She didn't say his name. She didn't dare give the moment a label until the moment gave her permission back. The shepherd strained once toward the man and then lay down with a heavy, relieved thud, as if a post had been set. "Logan," Morales said, testing the name like a gentle knock. "Is that your name?" The man flinched, not because of the sound but because of what it tried to wake. He looked at Mark again and then away. "He said the name is dead," he said, glancing toward Walter not with anger but with a loyalty that had been carefully watered. "He said names get people killed." Mark swallowed air that wouldn't go down. "Son," he said, and the word slipped out not as a title but as a plea. He lifted his hands again to show emptiness, to show he had nothing a cornered animal would fear. "You used to run the shoreline. You hated hats. You'd come back with your ears red and pretend you couldn't feel them." Logan's eyes flickered. In that flicker lived the faint memory of a kitchen timer and the first mouthful of hot coffee after a run. Then the flicker died under the weight of a single repeated story. Morales stepped into the space between the men and the man who had made the space necessary. "Walter," she said, turning finally. "You lied to officers about a generator. You obstructed a welfare check. You will not speak again unless spoken to." She nodded at the thermal camera. Document heat signature below, ladder position, ventilation duct, and any active power. To Logan, "Do you have injuries? Is there anyone else down there?" "No," he said, automatic. Then a beat. "I mean, no one who needs help." The correction cost him, as if speaking different grammar hurt. "He said we were safer until spring." "Spring is here early," Morales said. "I need you to step aside so my team can clear the space." Walter moved, and a lifetime of cabinet work and careful joints held nothing for him now. He started to speak, stopped when Morales raised one finger, and watched 3 uniforms descend. The radio chatter turned tight and technical. "Single chamber," an officer reported. "UX power. Carbon filter. Stocked shelves. Bunk books, first aid. No restraints." The absence of chains didn't clean the room. It made the big lie more complete. Morales had seen both kinds of prisons. The ones that bruise and the ones that convince you the door is a kindness. Mark took one step nearer and stopped at the edge of orders. "Logan," he said again, lighter this time, trying to respect the fragile bridge they were all standing on. "Do you remember the little scar on your right wrist from the planer at the shop? You kept telling me it made you look like you worked for a living." He pressed his own wrist with 2 fingers in the exact place. "It's still there." Logan looked down. There it was, the white half-moon of a careless Saturday. He pressed it too, as if checking whether a story could be touched. His shoulders softened a fraction. He glanced past Mark to Dana, who had not moved, and when she lowered her hand from her mouth, he saw the imprint of her fingers on her cheek like a watermark. He didn't know the script for this kind of scene. He didn't know why his chest hurt. Behind them, 2 officers eased Walter's wrists behind his back. He didn't fight. He stared at the hatch, jaw tight, eyes shining with the specific sorrow of a man losing the version of himself he spent years building. "I kept him alive," he said, not to the police, not to anyone, but to the open square that now exposed what he had called protection. I gave him rules. And you took his seasons, Morales replied, almost soft. You don't get to call that care. The radio crackled again. Detective, you need to see this. Journal, labeled entries, schedule grid. Also a laminated card with a checklist titled Surface Protocol. Morales met Walter's eyes and didn't look away. Truth leaves handwriting, she said to no one and everyone. Logan's attention snagged on the word journal. He glanced at Walter as if the book might contain his spine. Walter finally looked at Mark, not with apology but with a bleak, exhausted certainty that he'd been the only adult in a burning room. It was the last time those two men would stand on the same piece of ground and believe different worlds. Sir, Morales said to Logan, we'll get you medical evaluation and time to breathe. You can choose to sit with officers or with people who know your birthday. That's your call. Logan steadied on the one detail that didn't require belief. My birthday is in January, he said, tentative. I used to hate the cake because it tasted like candles. Dana nodded, tears she didn't wipe. You always blew them out too slow. The wind shifted and carried the faint scent of wintergreen from the lake. Somewhere a church bell counted a number that mattered to someone else. The shepherd lifted its head and watched the open square as if a door might close itself again if nobody kept watch. From the hatch, a draft rose that smelled like a life edited to one room. Morales put a hand out for Logan to step clear. He did, and the motion light caught his face fully for the first time. He looked like a man who has just learned that the sky is real. At Maple Shore Medical, fluorescent light washed everything in the same thin color, which was unfair to a man seeing sky again. Logan sat on the edge of an exam bed while Dr. Priya Shah pressed a stethoscope to his back and counted, then held a flashlight to each pupil and watched how they decided to live in this new brightness. He flinched at the squeak of the privacy curtain, then apologized out of reflex. Priya kept her tone level and practical. Hydration drip, baseline labs, bone density scan later this week, vitamin D supplementation now. She asked simple questions with answers that didn't threaten identity. What do you eat most days? How often do you sleep? Do you get headaches? The answers were precise the way routine is precise. Canned stews in rotation. Lights out at 2,200. Wake at 0600. Headaches only when the generator coughed. A life measured in checklists. Detective Morales waited in the hall, flipping through photocopies taken from the journal they'd found by the bunk. Each page wore a square grid and a steady hand. Surface condition, hostile. Rule 3, no names. Rule 7, noise equals risk. Some entries were small domestic notes dressed as tactics. Stretch wrists after maintenance, boil water twice, practice breathing slow. Others mapped a doctrine. When the world lies, build a room that doesn't. Morales had seen indoctrination written in harsher ink. What rattled her was the tenderness braided through control. The pen strokes shifted when Walter wrote about teaching Logan to repair filters or the satisfaction of a perfect cut on plywood. He hadn't only built a trap. He had built an apprenticeship for living inside one. Mark and Dana stood a few doors down with paper cups of coffee gone cold, staring at a mural of the lake that tried to look like summer. They didn't go in until Priya nodded. Even then, they stopped just inside the threshold, letting the room decide if it could hold this. Mark reached for something useful. We brought your sweatshirt, he said, lifting a gray bundle that used to be his and then was Logan's because sons steal from closets like it's a dialect. Smells like the garage, he added, because smell is a bridge. Logan took it in both hands and didn't put it on. He squeezed the cuffs and studied the fray, as if the ends could tell him what they remembered. Do I owe you rent? He asked, and the question landed with a weight that told the room where he'd lived. Dana stepped closer, voice careful. You owe us nothing. Not rent, not answers. Breathing is enough. Logan nodded, as if accepting a rule he wanted to keep. Priya explained the next hours. Fluids, a meal, observation, and the next days, therapy, labs, a gradual introduction to noise and daylight. She used verbs that returned agency. You can choose, you can pause, you can say stop. It was the opposite of a checklist. Back at the house, A squad cataloged the bunker while crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. The inventory sounded almost benign. Read out loud: shelf-stable food, paperbacks on wilderness survival, a hand crank radio, a manual on carpentry joints, a laminated card titled Surface Protocol. No photographs of Logan from before. No souvenirs taken from the Pierces. The absence wasn't an oversight, it was a design. When Morales reached the final journal, she found an entry that stopped her finger midline. If he remembers, remind him why remembering is dangerous. She set the book down like it could bruise. Walter Briggs was transported to county in a cruiser that smelled the same as the one Morales drove north in, and that symmetry annoyed her. During intake, he signed his name with a tradesman's block letters and asked one question: did he eat? When told yes, he closed his eyes, as if that single courtesy reduced his list of obligations. He didn't request a lawyer right away, he asked for a notepad. Denied, he stared at the blank wall with a concentration that looked like prayer and might have been a man rehearsing a version of events where he remained necessary. The arraignment moved quickly. Charges read: kidnapping of an adult, unlawful imprisonment, assault. The court set a bond that might as well have been a wall. Morales outlined the timeline for the prosecutor, building a narrative that respected the paradox. No visible chains, only invisible knots tied with fear and routine. She used Walter's words where possible. They were pointed, self-incriminating, and covered in a patina of care. She knew a jury would bristle at that mix. It's harder to hate a man who cooked stews and labeled shelves, even when the shelves lived under a lie. Harder, but not impossible. At sunset, the Pierces' driveway filled with people who didn't cross the porch. Neighbors left casseroles and notes and a snow shovel leaning where Mark would see it. Dana stood at the window and cried without hiding it, not because grief had ended but because a different weight had started. Mark took out the old county map and peeled away tape until the paper came loose in his hands like a skin. He folded it carefully, not as surrender but as punctuation. Logan's first night out, he couldn't sleep, the silence too wide after years of measured hum. Priya paged a counselor who specialized in re-entry after prolonged isolation. The counselor sat in the chair by the bed and coached him to name 5 things he could hear, 4 he could feel, 3 he could see. He named the heater, his pulse, a cart will squeak in the hall. He felt the cotton cuff, the bandage on his arm, the rough seam of the mattress. He saw his mother's hands folded on her knee, his father's boots by the door, and on the tray a hospital spoon catching a small, faithful moon of light. In the morning, Morales returned with a simple request and a risk attached. She showed Logan a photograph from the journal, a schedule grid with Sundays circled in red. "Why Sundays?" she asked. He stared at it, then smiled without meaning to. "He'd play music," he said. "Low. Always the same tape." Morales leaned in gently. "What song?" He searched for the name like it might be a border crossing. "A hymn about rivers," he said, eyes closing to listen. Then he opened them. "And a rule I never broke." He didn't say the rule. He didn't have to. It was written in him. Some rules don't survive daylight. By June the snow had surrendered and the lake threw light back at the town like a debt repaid. The bunker was gone, sealed by order of the court after forensics finished their slow work, and the backyard looked ordinary again in a way that felt like a lie told with flowers. Logan moved into a quiet apartment above a hardware store on Washington Street where mornings smelled like lumber and coffee. He kept the shade half open and the radio off. 2 blocks away, Dana learned to cook for 3 again without counting it. Mark relearned silence that wasn't fear. Detective Ana Morales built a case the way winter builds a cornice, 1 layer at a time until weight becomes a fact. The journals made a spine. The ledger receipts made ribs. The surface protocol card made a throat. Surveillance caught the small patterns that write bigger truths. The weekly fuel runs, the exactness of the shopping, the way Walter Briggs timed construction to storms. Within that precision, one surprise ticked like a modest bomb. Hidden behind a false back in Walter's garage cabinet, they found a tin box with 3 cassette tapes, each labeled Sunday. The songs were old standards recorded out of a radio, and in the margin of a logbook nearby Walter had written, "Noise as reward." The kindness was part of the cage. At Maple Shore Medical, Dr. Priya Shah kept her promises. Vitamin D returned to acceptable. Bone density numbers were rough but not catastrophic. The headaches eased. Therapy made new ruts on Logan's brain where there had been one deep trench. He learned to stand in grocery store aisles without counting exits. He learned to let the shower run without budgeting the minutes. He did not speak of the bunker unless he wanted to, and more often he did not. When he did, it was to test a sentence for load. What happens when I say I believe the sky was dangerous, and watch it hold? The hearing drew more people than benches. Walter wore county orange like a tradesman's apron he'd forgotten to take off, posture squared by a habit of exact work. He waved a preliminary speech and then, when the judge invited him, he spoke anyway. He said he had found a young man in a storm and pulled him back from a risk that eats people. He said the world outside had teeth and his rules had kept them from breaking flesh. He did not use the word kidnapping. He did not say, "I am sorry." He said, "I kept him fed." He said, "I taught him craft." He said, "I kept him alive." Morales sat 2 rows behind the prosecution and wrote a single word on her legal pad, "Seasons," then slid it into counsel's hand. The prosecutor asked Walter why Sundays had music while the rest of the week had generator hum and task lists. Walter stared at the table, finally shook his head. The answer was already in his log. Control wears light gloves when it wants loyalty. The judge listened, jaw set, and read a sentence whose weight no longer surprised anyone. Outside, reporters angled for quotes. Mark chose none. Dana put a hand on Logan's arm and he did not flinch. In the weeks after, the city commission adopted a modest ordinance requiring disclosure of underground structures during property inspections. It wasn't a cure. It was a hand on a lever. Morales launched a program she called Second Look, inviting residents to bring in oddities from cold cases, recurring lights, off-cycle deliveries, sheds with locks on the wrong side. The inbox filled faster than anyone guessed, most of it nothing, some of it noise that wasn't. She answered each respectfully, because a town that learns to listen again is a town that stays warmer in winter. Summer found the Pierces sitting on their back steps with paper plates and a bowl of strawberries that tasted like a memory done right. Logan wore the gray sweatshirt Mark had saved and let the sleeves swallow his hands. When a hymn floated out from a neighbor's open window, something about a river and a narrow path, his body tightened and then remembered what Priya had taught him. 5 things I can hear. 4 I can feel. 3 I can see. He named the wind in the birch leaves, the stretch of cotton at his wrist, the way Dana watched him like he might evaporate and then, slowly, remembered to blink like mothers blink when fear loosens its grip. Mark told an old garage joke from before and missed the punchline entirely, and it didn't matter. Logan laughed, a small sound that grew legs. He looked across the street at the spot where a door used to be and did not look away. There would be bad nights and broken sleep and days when the sky felt like a lid. There would also be Tuesdays that held, and Wednesdays that felt light, and slow Sundays that belonged to him instead of a calendar someone else drew.